The torches along the corridor burned with an amber glow that made the stone walls look like they were breathing. Miriam's footsteps echoed too loudly, each click of her worn boots a reminder that she didn't belong here. Beside her, Era Thorne walked with the kind of careful steps that came from years of survival. The older woman's hands trembled as she clutched a ring of keys. "Listen carefully," Era whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Do not look him in the eye. Ever. Even if he speaks directly to you, keep your gaze on the floor." Miriam nodded, throat dry. The palace of Varen rose around them like a monument to power, all carved stone and soaring ceilings. Banners depicting wolves in battle hung from iron rods, their eyes seeming to follow her progress down the hall. "Do not speak unless he asks you a direct question," Era continued, "and if you hear him growl, drop your gaze and back out of the room slowly. Never turn your back on him." Despite her racing heart, Miriam couldn't help the nervous laugh that escaped. "Is there anything he does like?" Era stopped walking. Her fingers went to the scars around her wrists, faint white lines that looked like teeth marks. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone hollow. "He used to like music." Before the screaming started, the words settled like ice in Miriam's stomach. She wanted to ask more, but they had reached the final door. 2 guards stood on either side, their expressions bored and cruel. One looked her up and down with a sneer. "Too thin," he muttered to his companion. "He'll send her away before dawn." "If she's lucky," the other replied. Era unlocked the door with shaking hands. The sound of the lock turning seemed impossibly loud. She pushed the door open just wide enough for Miriam to slip through, then grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Good luck," she whispered. Then the door closed behind Miriam with a heavy clank, and she heard the lock turn again from the outside. The antechamber was dim, lit only by a single candle on a side table. Miriam's wolf stirred inside her, uncertain whether to flee or submit. The scent hit her first, smoke and pine and something metallic like fresh iron. It was overwhelming, primal, the kind of scent that made every instinct scream danger. "Who are you?" The growl came from the shadows near the fireplace. Miriam's knees nearly buckled. She forced herself to keep her eyes on the floor as a figure emerged into the candlelight. Alpha King Kale Varen was exactly what the rumors promised and somehow worse. Broad shoulders filled out a simple black shirt. Sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked with old scars. His hair was dark as ink, falling just past his collar in waves that looked like they hadn't seen a proper cut in months. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They glowed faintly in the low light, amber edged with gold, fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. He didn't look feral. He looked exhausted in a way that seemed permanent, like someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. "I asked you a question." His voice was rough, lacking the smooth authority she'd expected from a king. "Miriam, Your Majesty," she managed, hating how small her voice sounded. "I've been assigned to night duty, in your wing." He stared at her for a long moment, and she felt his wolf presence pressing against hers, testing, searching. Then he turned away with a dismissive flick of his fingers. "There's a bucket and brush by the hearth. The stone needs scrubbing. The bed frame needs polishing. You'll work in silence." "Yes, Your Majesty." She moved carefully to the supplies, hyper-aware of his presence behind her. The chamber was larger than she'd expected, with a massive bed draped in dark furs, a writing desk covered in papers, and shelves lined with books that looked untouched. Everything was immaculate, except for the hearth, where soot had built up in dark streaks. Miriam knelt and began scrubbing, the brush making soft scratching sounds against stone. She could feel his gaze on her back, heavy and unrelenting. Minutes stretched, like hours. Her arms began to ache, but she didn't dare slow down or make a sound. The silence pressed in until she felt like she might scream just to break it. Without thinking, she muttered under her breath, "Floors cleaner than half the nobles' souls." The moment the words left her mouth, she froze. Era's warning crashed through her mind. Her hands stopped moving, brush suspended over the stone. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of a chair. Then his voice, flat and cold. "I do not keep maids for entertainment, girl." But there had been something else in his tone. Something that might have been the ghost of amusement before the coldness crushed it. Miriam didn't dare turn around. She went back to scrubbing with renewed focus, cheeks burning. Time passed in tense silence. She moved from the hearth to the bed frame, using a soft cloth to polish the dark wood. The bed was enormous, clearly built for someone larger than human size. She tried not to think about what that meant. She was wiping down the final post when she heard it. A low, ragged sound that made her wolf whimper in distress. She turned before she could stop herself. The Alpha King had gone rigid in his chair, one hand pressed to his temple. His jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. His eyes had gone unfocused, and the glow had intensified until they were nearly burning. "Are you all right?" The question burst out before she could think better of it. His head snapped toward her, and suddenly those burning eyes were locked on hers. His wolf surged forward, and she felt the full weight of his dominance crash into her like a physical blow. Her knees hit the floor without her permission. "Get out!" The command was spoken in a voice that held both man and beast, layered and terrible. "Now." Miriam scrambled backward, abandoning the cloth and supplies. She fumbled for the door, nearly falling in her haste. The lock clicked from the outside just as she reached it, and the door swung open. She stumbled through, and it slammed shut behind her. Aira was waiting in the corridor, eyes wide. She grabbed Miriam's arm and pulled her away from the door. "What happened? What did you do?" "Nothing. He had some kind of attack. A headache, maybe." I asked if he was all right. Aira's face went pale. "You spoke to him? During an episode?" "I didn't know. When the poison hits, he sometimes passes out like a dead man." Aira's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But he wakes saying he heard everything." "Everything." They hurried down the corridor, and Miriam pressed one hand to her racing heart. Her wolf was still trembling, caught between terror and something else. Something that felt dangerously like concern. Behind them, in the locked chamber, the Alpha King remained alone with his pain, and Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that her night in that room had only just begun. "If you're already feeling your pulse race, stay with me. This is just the first night, and the real test hasn't even started yet." 3 nights later, Miriam knelt on the cold stone floor outside the Alpha King's chambers, scrubbing at a stain that had probably been there for years. Her knees ached and her hands were raw, but she welcomed the pain. It gave her something to focus on besides the heavy door at her back and what waited beyond it. Her mind drifted, as it often did during the long night hours, to a memory from childhood. She had been 10, maybe 11, walking the borderlands of her family's small territory. Snow had fallen thick that year, turning the world into a white silence that swallowed sound. She'd heard the whimpering first. Soft, pained, coming from a dense thicket of thorns. Her mother had warned her about going into the wild alone, but the sound pulled at something deep in her chest. She'd pushed through the branches, ignoring the scratches on her arms, until she found it. A wolf pup, barely old enough to be away from its mother, tangled in a hunter's snare. The wire had cut deep into its leg, and blood stained the snow around it. Its fur was dark, almost black, and its eyes were bright amber even through the pain. "Please don't die," she'd whispered, kneeling in the snow. The pup had tried to snap at her, but it was too weak. She'd worked carefully at the snare, her small fingers nimble despite the cold. When the wire finally came free, the pup had collapsed. She'd torn a strip from her underskirt to bind the wound, and then she'd done something foolish. She'd untied the woven bracelet from her own wrist, the one her grandmother had made before she died, and carefully looped it around the pup's neck. "So you won't forget," she'd told it, "that someone loved you once." The pup's eyes had met hers, bright and aware in a way that seemed almost human. Then it had dragged itself up and limped away into the trees. She'd never seen it again. Her family had called her foolish when they found out. That bracelet had been worth something. And for what? A wild animal that would probably die anyway? The sound of a lock turning snapped her back to the present. Aira appeared, her face drawn. "He's asking for you," she said simply. Miriam gathered her supplies with trembling hands and stepped through the door. The chamber looked different tonight. Someone had lit more candles, and a fire burned in the hearth. The Alpha King stood by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. "Your Majesty," she said softly, keeping her eyes down. "Continue your work." His voice was quieter tonight, lacking the sharp edge from their first meeting. "And do not stop because of me." She moved to the hearth and began her routine. The silence felt less oppressive tonight, though she couldn't say why. She was aware of him moving around the room, the soft rustle of papers, the creak of wood as he sat at his desk. At one point, she realized she was humming. The sound was barely audible, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, but she froze the moment she recognized what she was doing. She waited for the reprimand. It never came. When she risked a glance toward the desk, she found him bent over his work, a slight furrow between his brows. If he'd noticed her humming, he gave no sign. The nights began to blur together after that. Each evening, she was led into his chambers. Each evening, she cleaned while he worked or read or simply sat staring into the fire. They never spoke beyond the initial greeting, but the silence grew more comfortable, less like a threat and more like a shared space. She noticed things, the way his shoulders would tighten when footsteps passed in the corridor outside, The way his hand would flex and curl into a fist when he read certain reports. The fine scar along his jaw that looked like it had been made by claws. The dark circles under his eyes that suggested he rarely, if ever, slept. One night, she was polishing the mantel when her skirt brushed against his knee. She'd been reaching for a candlestick, hadn't realized he'd moved his chair closer to the fire. The contact was brief, barely there, but they both froze. She could feel the heat of him through the fabric, could smell that scent of smoke and pine intensified by proximity. Her wolf stirred, pressing forward with interest instead of fear, that terrified her more than any growl could have. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she whispered, stepping back quickly. He cleared his throat, a rough sound. "Continue." But his voice had gone tight, and when she glanced at him from under her lashes, she saw his hand was clenched on the arm of his chair, knuckles white. She finished her work quickly that night and left without the usual soft goodbye. What neither of them knew was that far from that quiet chamber, in a council room deep in the palace, 3 people sat around a polished table planning in whispers. "She's getting too comfortable," Darian Voss said, his voice cold and precise. He was a lean man with silver threading through his dark hair, his eyes sharp as broken glass. "I've seen the way he listens when she's in the room, the way his wolf settles. Is that not what we want?" Aveline Mora's voice was soft, almost musical, but there was steel underneath. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, with pale blonde hair and eyes that never seemed to blink often enough. "If she calms him, she makes our work easier, or she makes him question us," Darian countered. "He's already asking more questions about the reports we bring him, wanting to visit the border territories himself instead of trusting our assessments." Oren Lys, the Alpha King's cousin, leaned back in his chair. He was younger than the other 2, with a face that might have been kind if not for the calculating gleam in his eyes. "Then we test her," he said simply. "Kale knows how to pretend to sleep. We've all seen him do it. He uses it to catch servants in small betrayals. Let him use it now to prove whether this maid is genuinely devoted or just another knife aimed at his back." Aveline smiled, and it didn't reach her eyes. "If she fails the test, we remove her. If she passes, we have proof she can be trusted, and Kale stops questioning our other recommendations." "And if she's smarter than we think?" Darian asked. "Then we ensure the evidence against her is too clear to ignore," Oren replied. "Either way, we maintain control." They spoke for another hour, refining the plan, discussing the timing. None of them noticed the servant who'd been clearing dishes from a side table, a young woman with sharp ears and a good memory. She slipped from the room unnoticed and disappeared into the maze of palace corridors. Back in his private chamber, Kale stood at his window, watching Miraine cross the courtyard far below. She carried an armload of firewood, her small figure bent under the weight. As he watched, another servant approached and took half the load without being asked. Miraine's face broke into a smile that made something in his chest twist painfully. His fingers found the edge of the window frame, gripping until the wood groaned. His wolf paced inside him, restless and confused. She smelled like home, like safety, like something he'd lost and couldn't name. It made no sense. She was nobody, a disgraced noble's daughter traded like property. But when she was in his room, his wolf went quiet for the first time since the battlefield. Since the poison, since his world had fractured into blackouts and blood and the certainty that everyone he trusted wanted him dead or controlled. "If you are a blade," he whispered to her distant figure, "I will not let it pierce me slowly." The decision was made before he fully acknowledged it. He would test her. He would use the trick he'd perfected over months of paranoia and prove, once and for all, whether this strange piece she brought him was real or just another trap. He turned from the window and moved to his chair by the fire, already practicing the controlled breathing, the careful slackening of muscles, already preparing for the night he would pretend to sleep and finally learn the truth. The palace kitchens were warm and loud, a stark contrast to the cold silence of the upper floors. Miraine sat at a scarred wooden table, helping Naira peel potatoes for the evening meal. Naira was round and cheerful, with flour perpetually dusted in her dark hair and a smile that came easy. "I heard he tore 3 tapestries last week," Naira was saying, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just ripped them off the walls with his bare hands. They say his wolf is taking over, bit by bit." "I've never seen him do anything like that," Miraine said quietly, focusing on her potato. "He's always been what? Tired. Just very tired." Naira gave her a long look. "You're the only one who goes in that room and comes out defending him. Everyone else has stories. Maybe everyone else doesn't actually see him," Miraine replied. She set down her knife and met Naira's eyes. "He's still our king. Maybe he deserves better than gossip." Later that day, as Miraine carried fresh linens through a corridor near the council chambers, she heard voices. The door was slightly ajar, and though she knew she shouldn't listen, something made her pause. His judgment is weakening by the day, a man's voice said, cold and clipped. Darian Voss. She'd learned his name from other servants. If we don't act soon, he'll start questioning everything we've built. Mirian's hands tightened on the linens. She should walk away. This was none of her concern, but the voice that answered made her freeze. Let him question. We control the answers. We always have. That was Aveline, the ethereal woman who sometimes visited the king's chambers with tea and reports. The servant said she was kind, but Miriam had never trusted the way her eyes never quite focused on anything. Another maid appeared at the end of the corridor, an older woman Miriam vaguely recognized. She beckoned urgently. Come help me with these dishes. I'll pay you 2 silver coins. It was a fortune for such simple work. The woman wanted information, Miriam realized. Wanted to know what she'd heard. The coins would have been enough to buy a new pair of boots, maybe some warmer stockings for the coming winter. Miriam shook her head and walked away. Behind her, she heard the older maid mutter something unflattering, but she didn't stop. That night, when she was led into the Alpha King's chamber, the tension was different. He sat at his desk, but he wasn't working. He was just sitting, staring at nothing, his jaw tight. Your Majesty? She asked softly. Continue, he said without looking at her. She began her usual routine, but something felt wrong. The air was too thick, too charged. She moved around the room as quietly as possible, but she could feel his awareness tracking her every movement. She was opening one of the tall windows to let in fresh air when it happened. The window was stuck, swollen from recent rain, and she had to lean across him to get the leverage she needed. She didn't realize how close she was until she felt his hand brush against her waist, steadying her instinctively. The touch burned through the thin fabric of her dress. She could feel the calluses on his palm, the heat of his skin, the careful control in his fingers. Her breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he jerked his hand back like she'd scorched him. Leave it closed, he said, his voice rough. The wind is too cold tonight. Yes, Your Majesty. She stepped away quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could still feel the ghost of his touch, and her wolf was pushing forward with an eagerness that frightened her. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of complication that could get her thrown out or worse. She finished her work in record time and practically fled the room. Behind her, she didn't see KL lift his hand and stare at it, flexing his fingers slowly, like he could still feel the curve of her waist against his palm. 3 days later, the council convened again. This time, all the key players were present. Darian, Aveline, Oren, and the Alpha King himself. Aveline placed a small glass vial on the polished table. It was barely the length of her thumb, filled with a dark liquid that seemed to absorb the candlelight. We found this, she said softly, in the pocket of one of the maids. She claims she doesn't know how it got there, but the resemblance to the poison used against you before is unmistakable. Kyle stared at the vial, his expression unreadable. Inside, his wolf snarled and paced. Which maid? We're not certain yet, Darian interjected smoothly. Several have access to your wing, but someone is bringing poison into the palace, getting it past our guards, placing it within reach of your chambers. We need to identify them before they succeed. Oren leaned forward, his elbows on the table. You have a skill that could help us. The sleep technique. You've used it before to catch servants in small thefts. Small lies. Use it now to catch a killer. Kale's hands curled into fists under the table. You want me to spy on my own staff? We want you to survive, Aveline said, her voice dripping false concern. And the maid who spends the most time alone with you is the new one. The Solon girl. The name hit him like a physical blow. His wolf surged forward, teeth bared, rejecting the accusation entirely. But the human part of him, the part that had been poisoned and betrayed, whispered that this was exactly what he should expect. Too good to be true. Too perfect. Too calming. I'll consider it, he said, his voice flat. Consider quickly, Darian urged. We don't know how much time we have. After they left, Kale sat alone in the council chamber for a long time. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of the table, and he barely recognized the man he'd become. Suspicious, isolated, testing everyone who came near. He remembered the way Miriam had touched his scarred knuckles once, carefully, when she'd thought he was distracted by a report. The way she hummed while she worked. The way she defended him to another servant. Her voice firm and sure. He wanted to believe her. His wolf howled at him to believe her. But belief without proof had almost killed him once. He couldn't afford it again. That night, alone in his chamber, he practiced in front of the mirror. He sat in his chair, let his body slacken, controlled his breathing, until it mimicked sleep. His head lolled naturally to the side, his fingers loosened. To any observer, he would appear completely unconscious. But behind his closed lids, he remained aware of everything. The crackle of the fire, the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor, the rapid beating of his own treacherous heart. "If you're real," he whispered to his reflection, "you'll pass. If you're not, better I bleed now than later." He looked at the chair, the fire, the cup of tea, already prepared on the side table. Tomorrow night, he would drink it, would let his body mimic sleep, and he would finally know the truth about the maid who had somehow slipped past every wall he'd built. And if she failed, if she proved to be just another knife aimed at his back, at least he would have his answer. At least he would know that the loneliness was deserved. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the chamber in shifting shadows. Cale sat in his chair, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and wrapped his fingers around the cup of tea. It had gone lukewarm, but that was part of the plan. A king who had fallen asleep wouldn't notice cold tea. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat loud enough that he was certain she would hear it when she entered. He forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly, practicing the rhythm he'd perfected over months of paranoia. 4 counts in, hold for 3, 6 counts out. The pattern of deep sleep. He lifted the cup to his lips, took a small sip just for the appearance of it, then let his body begin to slacken. His head tilted naturally to the side, finding the worn spot on the chair's high back. His fingers loosened around the cup, still holding it but barely. His lashes lowered until his vision was reduced to thin slits of firelight. The lock clicked. He heard Ira's whispered instructions in the corridor, then the soft creak of hinges. Miriam's footsteps were nearly silent, but he'd learned the particular rhythm of them over the past weeks. Light, quick, hesitant. The door closed. The lock turned. They were alone. Through his lashes, he watched her pause just inside the room. She stood very still, probably waiting to see if he would acknowledge her. When he didn't move, didn't speak, she took a careful step forward. This was the moment. This was when he would learn the truth. Miriam's breath caught softly as she took in the sight before her. The Alpha King. Head tilted back, throat exposed, completely vulnerable. She'd never seen him like this. In all the nights she'd worked in his chamber, he'd never once let his guard down, never relaxed enough to sleep in her presence. He looked different like this. The harsh lines of his face had softened slightly. His mouth relaxed instead of pressed into its usual firm line. His lashes were long and dark, casting shadows on his sharp cheekbones. One strand of hair had fallen across his forehead. Her wolf stirred, but not with fear, with something tender and protective that made her chest ache. He looked so tired, even in sleep. Like the rest wasn't quite enough. She forced herself to move, to begin her usual routine. She set down her supplies carefully, then began picking up the scattered papers on his desk, organizing them into neat stacks. Every movement was slow, deliberate, trying not to make any sound that might wake him. Behind closed lashes, Cale tracked her every move. He heard the whisper of fabric as she moved, the soft click of papers being aligned, the barely audible sigh when she found his desk in its usual state of chaos. He waited for the moment when her path would take her to the side table, to the tea, to whatever poison she might have hidden in her apron. Any moment now, she would make her move. Any moment. His worst fears would be confirmed. Miriam moved through the room like a ghost, dusting surfaces that barely needed dusting, straightening things that were already straight. She kept glancing back at him, worried that her movements might disturb him. She'd heard from other servants that he barely slept, that when he did, the nightmares made him wake screaming. Let him have this, she thought. Let him have one night of peace. She approached his chair carefully, meaning to adjust the fire so it wouldn't die completely before morning. As she knelt by the hearth, adding 2 small logs, she noticed his hand was still wrapped around the cup of tea. The liquid inside had long since gone cold. He was going to wake up with his hand cramped and aching. The thought bothered her more than it should have. Cale felt her presence nearby, felt the warmth of the fire flare as she fed it. His muscles were starting to ache from holding so still, but he didn't dare move. Not yet. She was close now. So close he could smell the faint lavender soap she used, could hear the soft catch in her breathing. Now, his mind whispered. Now she'll do it. But Miriam didn't reach for anything hidden. Instead, she knelt beside his chair, her dress pooling around her. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression soft in the firelight. Then, very gently, she reached out and began to ease his fingers away from the cup. Her touch was feather-light, careful not to wake him. She peeled his fingers back one at a time, supporting the cup with her other hand so it wouldn't fall. Kale's breath nearly hitched when he felt the warmth of her skin against his, when her thumb brushed over the scars on his knuckles. She lingered there, her fingers tracing the raised lines of old wounds with a tenderness that made something in his chest crack. He felt her fingertips map each scar, felt the slight tremor in her touch. "You're so tired," she whispered, barely audible. "You deserve to rest." She set the cup carefully on the side table, then turned back to him. Kale waited for her next move, his heart hammering so hard he was certain she would notice. This was it. This was when she would strike, would slip something into his drink, would reach for the signet ring on his hand, would do whatever she'd been sent here to do. Instead, Miriam reached into her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She placed it carefully on his lap, smoothing it with shaking hands. Then she untied something from her own wrist, and Kale felt her lift his hand again, felt her loop a woven bracelet around his fingers. The bracelet was old, made of faded blue and green threads, the pattern simple but distinctive. The moment she tied it, a memory crashed through him with the force of a physical blow. Snow, blood and white powder, small hands working at a wire snare, a voice whispering, "Please don't die." The weight of a bracelet around his neck, the first kindness he'd known in his young life. No, it couldn't be. She couldn't be. Miriam's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. She was speaking, her words soft and thick with unshed tears. "I have to leave tomorrow," she said to his sleeping form. "I'm so sorry, but I have to go. They're going to use me against you, and I won't let that happen. I won't be another weapon pointed at your heart." Her hand was still holding his, the bracelet between their palms. Kale felt her thumb brush over his knuckles again, felt the tremor in her fingers increase. "I love you," she whispered, and the words shattered something inside him. "I know I shouldn't. I know you'll never feel the same. But I do, and that's exactly why I have to leave. Because love means protecting you, even if it's from myself." Then she leaned forward, and Kale felt the soft press of her lips against his scarred knuckles. The kiss was gentle, lingering, warm. She was crying now. He could feel the dampness of tears on his skin. "Be safe," she breathed against his hand. "Find someone you can trust. Someone who deserves you." She pulled away slowly, carefully laying his hand back on the arm of the chair. Through the slits of his lashes, Kale watched her stand, watched her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at him one last time, and her expression was full of a love so pure and painful that it burned to witness. Then she turned and walked toward the door, her steps quick like she was forcing herself to leave before she could change her mind. The moment the door closed behind her, Kale's control shattered. A single tear escaped, sliding from the corner of his closed eye down his temple, then another. His breath hitched, and suddenly he was gasping, his carefully controlled breathing destroyed by sobs he couldn't hold back. He opened his eyes and stared at the bracelet still twined around his fingers. The same pattern, the same worn threads. She was the girl from the border, the one who had saved him when he was nothing but a wounded pup, the one who had given him her most precious possession and sent him back into the wild with kindness. And she'd just done it again. Sacrificed herself to protect him. He picked up the letter she'd left, unfolding it with shaking hands. The words blurred through his tears, but the meaning was clear. A formal resignation. She was leaving the palace, leaving him, because she believed staying would put him in danger. She had thought he was asleep. She had believed herself alone. And with no witnesses, no reason to perform, she had chosen love over betrayal. She had chosen his safety over her own heart. Kale pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to stop the tears, but they kept coming, silent, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. The test was over. He had his answer, and it had destroyed every story he'd ever believed about loyalty, about love, about the impossibility of finding someone genuine in a world full of knives. He clutched the bracelet to his chest and wept like he hadn't wept since the battlefield, since the poison, since the night his world had turned to ash. But these weren't tears of pain or betrayal. These were tears of relief, of grief for the loneliness he'd carried, of desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he'd believed. In the corridor outside, Miriam pressed her back against the cold stone wall, one hand over her mouth to muffle her own crying. She had to leave before dawn, had to get as far from the palace as possible before anyone could use her as a tool against him. Even if it killed her to go, even if leaving him felt like tearing out her own heart, neither of them slept that night. Both of them ached with the weight of a love neither had expected and both had to face alone. For now, dawn broke over the palace of Varin, painting the stone walls in shades of amber and gold. Kale stood at his window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, the woven bracelet tight around his wrist. He hadn't moved from this spot for hours, watching the courtyard below for any sign of her. He'd read her resignation letter 17 times. Each word was carefully chosen, formal, giving no hint of the emotion that had poured from her when she'd thought him asleep. She cited a family obligation, a need to return home. She thanked him for the opportunity to serve. It was all lies, and he knew it. She was running to protect him, sacrificing herself because she believed staying would make her a weapon in someone else's hands. The question was, whose hands? A knock at his door made him turn. Enter. Darian Voss stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral. Your Majesty, I heard the night maid submitted her resignation. Shall I assign a replacement? No. The word came out harder than he'd intended. Cale forced himself to breathe, to think clearly. I want to speak with my council. This morning, before breakfast, something flickered in Darian's eyes. Surprise? Concern? Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I summon Aveline and Oren as well? Especially them. When Darian left, Cale finally moved from the window. He washed his face, changed his shirt, and stood in front of the mirror. The man staring back at him looked different, still exhausted, still marked by scars, but his eyes held something new, clarity, purpose. He touched the bracelet on his wrist and made a promise. He would find the truth. He would protect her. And he would stop testing the only person who had proven genuine. The council chamber felt different in morning light. Cale sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Darian, Aveline, and Oren took their usual seats, all wearing expressions of polite attention. The maid has resigned, Cale said without preamble. The one you were concerned about. The Solon girl. A wise decision on her part, Aveline said softly. Perhaps she sensed our suspicions. Perhaps. Cale leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Tell me again about the poison vial you found. Which maid's pocket was it in? We didn't specify, Darian said carefully. We were still investigating when you said one of the maids. You implied multiple had access to my wing. But when I asked my night guard yesterday, he told me only 3 people have regular access to my private chambers outside of scheduled audiences. Myself, my night maid, and Aveline, who brings me evening tea. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Aveline's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. Are you suggesting I would harm you? Her voice held hurt, confusion, the perfect wounded innocence. I'm suggesting, Cale said quietly, that the evidence is convenient, that the timing is suspicious, that a maid with no connections, no resources, and no reason to want me dead suddenly becomes a suspect the moment she starts to. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The moment she becomes comfortable in her position. Oren leaned forward. Cousin, I understand you've grown fond of the girl, but have you investigated the tea? Cale interrupted. The tea that Aveline has brought me every evening for the past 6 months? The tea I drink right before my worst blackouts? Darian's face went carefully blank. The tea comes from our own stores. It's checked by our physicians. Then you won't mind if I have it checked by different physicians, ones you haven't recommended. The words hung in the air like a blade. Cale watched their faces, saw the minute tightening around Darian's eyes, the way Aveline's fingers curled slightly on the table. Oren was better at hiding his reaction, but even he couldn't quite mask the tension in his shoulders. Of course not, Darian said smoothly. We want only your safety, Your Majesty. If there's been any contamination, we should know immediately. Good. Cale stood. I'll have the samples collected this morning. You're all dismissed. They filed out, their movements controlled, their faces neutral. But Cale could smell the shift in the air. Fear, anger, the acrid stink of plans falling apart. The moment they were gone, he called for Aira. The older maid entered nervously, wringing her hands. Your Majesty? Miraine Salon. Where is she now? In the servants' quarters, Your Majesty. Packing her things. Bring her to me. Not to this chamber. To the library. And Aira? He caught her gaze. Let her see the steel underneath. Tell her she's not in trouble. Tell her I need to speak with her about a matter from her childhood. Can you do that? Aira nodded quickly and disappeared. Cale allowed himself one moment of weakness, pressing his palm against his chest where his heart hammered. Then he straightened his shoulders and headed for the library. Miraine stood in the library's entrance, her bag clutched in both hands, her eyes red from crying. Kyle drank in the sight of her. This woman who had bandaged a dying wolf pup and changed the course of his life without knowing it. Your Majesty, Do you remember? He interrupted gently. A winter day on the border? A wolf pup in a snare? Her breath caught. Her eyes went wide, searching his face. How could you? He held up his wrist, showing her the bracelet. You told me not to forget that someone loved me once. I never did. I've been searching for you for years without knowing what I was looking for. Tears spilled down her cheeks. That was you? That was me. He took a step closer, then another, until only a few feet separated them. You saved me then. You tried to save me again last night. But Miriam, I don't need saving from you. I need saving from the people who have been poisoning me and blaming everyone else. What do you mean? He told her everything. The battlefield, the original poisoning, the blackouts, the tests. He told her about the tea, the convenient evidence, the pattern he'd been too isolated to see. Her expression shifted from confusion to horror to cold fury. They've been hurting you, she said, her voice trembling with anger. Your own advisors. The people you trust most. Trusted, he corrected. Past tense. But I need proof. The library doors burst open. Guards poured in, followed by Darian and Aveline. Darian's face was flushed with false concern. Your Majesty, thank the gods we found you in time. He gestured sharply to the guards. Seize her. We found another vial in her quarters. She's been planning to poison you tonight. Miriam's bag was ripped from her hands. A guard pulled out a small glass vial, identical to the one from the council meeting. Her face went pale. I've never seen that before. I swear Enough lies, Aveline said, her voice sad but firm. We gave you every chance to confess. Cale felt his wolf surge forward, felt the familiar rage building. But underneath it was something new. Clarity. He looked at Darian's too perfect timing, at the vial that looked exactly like the evidence they'd shown before, at Aveline's belt, where identical vials hung in a decorative row, labeled as healing tinctures. Wait, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. How did you know to search her quarters? Darian blinked. We received information. From whom? I gave no such order. And this vial. He plucked it from the guard's hand, held it up to the light. It's identical to the ones on Aveline's belt, the ones she carries for her healing work. Those are completely different, Aveline said quickly. Mine are for... Then you won't mind if we test them both, Cale interrupted. Right now, in front of witnesses. The silence was deafening. Then Darian moved, his hand dropping to his sword. But Cale had been expecting it. His command voice, the one that held all the weight of his alpha dominance, crashed through the room. Stand down. All of you. Now. Every guard dropped to one knee, unable to resist. Only Darian and Aveline remained standing, and the effort to do so was clear on their faces. Cousin, Oren said from the doorway, his voice shaking. I need to tell you something. He pulled papers from his jacket, financial records, showing payments from border territories to Darian's family accounts, correspondence proving they engineered the original battlefield poisoning. I've been trying to prove it for months, but I was afraid they'd kill you before I could. Darian lunged for Oren, but Cale was faster. His hand caught Darian's throat, slamming him against the wall with enough force to crack the stone. You, Cale growled, his wolf bleeding into his voice, have been poisoning me, controlling me, keeping me weak and isolated so you could rule through me. You were always too soft, Darian spat, too weak to do what needed to be done. We made you strong. We made you feared. You made me a prisoner in my own castle. Cale's hand tightened. Guards, take them to the cells, all of them, and send for the physicians, the real ones, not the ones on their payroll. As Darian and Aveline were dragged away, Cale turned to find Miriam still standing frozen, tears streaming down her face. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, not caring who saw, not caring about protocol or propriety. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I'm sorry I tested you. I'm sorry I spied instead of trusting. You deserved better. Her hands clutched his shirt, and she sobbed against his chest. You were hurt. You were trying to survive. I was a coward, he corrected. And I almost lost you because of it. She pulled back enough to look at him, her eyes searching his face. What happens now? Now? He touched her cheek gently, wiping away her tears with his thumb. Now we begin again. No tests, no spying, just truth. But even as he held her, even as relief flooded through him, he knew truth wasn't the same as trust. And trust, real trust, would take time to rebuild. 3 days had passed since the arrests. 3 days of investigations, interrogations, and revelations that shook the palace to its foundations. Darian and Aveline had been poisoning Cale for over a year, microdosing him with a compound designed to keep his wolf unstable and his judgment clouded. They'd been embezzling from the treasury, manipulating border conflicts to increase their own holdings, and systematically removing anyone who got too close to the truth. Oren had been quietly gathering evidence for months, terrified they'd kill Kale before he could prove anything. He'd been the one to suggest the sleep test, hoping it would finally show Kale that not everyone in his life was corrupt. The kingdom was in an uproar. The healers confirmed the poisoning, the financial auditors confirmed the embezzlement, and the Alpha King, for the first time in over a year, could feel his wolf settling into something resembling peace. But that peace didn't extend to his heart. Miriam had been moved to guest quarters, given new clothes, offered an official position as a palace liaison. She'd accepted everything with quiet grace and maintained a careful distance from Kale. They hadn't spoken alone since the library. She attended council meetings when requested, provided testimony about what she'd overheard, and then disappeared back to her rooms. Kale couldn't blame her, but it was driving him slowly insane. Tonight, he'd asked her to come to his chambers, not as a maid, but as a guest. She'd arrived wearing a simple dress in deep blue, her hair pulled back, her expression guarded. "Your Majesty," she said, staying near the door. "Kale," he corrected softly. "Please, just Kale." She nodded but didn't move closer. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself, like she was ready to run at any moment. "I wanted to thank you," he started, then stopped. "No, that's not right. I wanted to apologize. Again, more thoroughly." "You already apologized. For testing you, yes, but not for this." He gestured between them, at the careful distance, the walls she'd built. "Not for making you afraid to be in the same room as me." Her eyes flashed with something between hurt and anger. "I'm not afraid of you. Then what are you afraid of?" "This," the word burst out of her. "You standing there looking at me like I'm something precious, when 3 days ago you thought I was trying to kill you. When you spent weeks spying on me instead of just asking if I cared about you. You're right." He took a step toward her, then stopped himself. "You're absolutely right. I used your feelings as evidence. I treated your heart like a weapon that needed testing. And I have no right to ask for anything from you now. Then why am I here?" Her voice cracked. "Why did you ask me to come to your room? To the place where you pretended to sleep while I poured out my heart?" He moved closer, drawn by the pain in her voice. "Because I can't breathe when you're not near me. Because my wolf hasn't been quiet in over a year. And the moment you walk into a room, everything settles. Because I'm in love with you. And I know I don't deserve you. But I'm too selfish not to tell you anyway." The words hung between them. Miriam stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're in love with me," she repeated slowly. "But you don't trust me." "I trust you completely. You're the only person I trust." "No." She shook her head. "Trust isn't something you decide after passing a test. Trust is built through 1,000 small choices, through vulnerability and communication and believing in someone even when you're scared. Then teach me." He took another step, and this time she didn't back away. "Teach me how to do this right. Because I've spent so long surviving that I've forgotten how to live. I've forgotten how to let someone in without turning it into a strategy." They were standing close now, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she still used, could see the gold flecks in her eyes. The heat between them was palpable, a physical thing that made his skin tight and his breath shallow. She reached up, her fingers hovering near his face. "Do you want me to touch you?" The question, the permission it asked for, made his throat tight. "Yes." Her palm cupped his cheek, and he leaned into it instinctively. Her thumb brushed over his cheekbone, and he saw her eyes darken with something that made his wolf rumble with approval. "And if I kissed you right now," she whispered, "would you wonder tomorrow if I had some hidden reason for it?" He closed his eyes, shame burning through him. "No. Are you sure?" Her other hand came up, framing his face, making him look at her. "Because I can't do this halfway, Kale. I can't give you my heart and wonder if you're going to test it every time you're scared." "No more tests," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I swear it. No more spying, no more tricks. Just us, learning this together." She studied his face for a long moment, and he forced himself to stay still, to let her search for whatever she needed to see. Then, slowly, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like she was testing the waters despite her words. But when he didn't pull away, when his hands came up to gently grip her waist, she deepened it. Her fingers slid into his hair, and he made a sound low in his throat that was part growl, part plea. Heat flooded through him, desire mixing with something deeper, something that felt like coming home. He pulled her closer, careful of his strength, and she melted against him like she'd been waiting for this since the first night in his chambers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she said again. But this time she was looking at him, making sure he heard it while he was awake. "But I need more than words from you. I need to see you change. I need to watch you build trust with actions, not just promises." "I will," he said, his hands trembling slightly where they rested on her waist. "I'll prove it to you. Every day. For as long as you'll let me." She kissed him again, quick and sweet, then stepped back. His hands fell away reluctantly. "I'm staying in the palace," she said. "In my own room. I'll attend councils. I'll help you rebuild what they destroyed. But we do this slowly. We do this right." "Separate rooms," he agreed, even though his wolf howled in protest. "No rushing. No assumptions." She smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her in days. "And if you even think about testing me, you'll know," he finished. "Because I'll tell you first. I'll tell you when I'm scared, when I'm doubting, when my past is making me paranoid. No more hiding." "Good." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Kale?" "Yes? Thank you for crying that night. It told me more about who you really are than any test ever could." Then she was gone, leaving him alone in the chamber where he'd pretended to sleep, where he'd almost lost her because he'd been too afraid to trust. He touched his lips, still feeling the warmth of her kiss, and made a silent promise. No more tests, no more walls, just the slow, terrifying work of loving someone without fear. 4 months had passed since the night Miriam had kissed him and walked away. 4 months of learning what trust looked like in practice instead of theory. At first, the changes had been small. Kyle asking her permission before entering her workspace. Miriam inviting him to take walks in the garden, where they could be seen by others. They shared meals in the public dining hall instead of his private chambers. They talked, really talked, about everything from childhood memories to kingdom politics to their fears about the future. The kingdom watched with curiosity as their reclusive king began to emerge from his isolation. He visited villages personally, listening to concerns instead of reading filtered reports. He appointed new advisors, choosing based on merit instead of fear. And everywhere he went, the former maid-turned-liaison was at his side, not behind him. Kale left books outside her door every few days, always on subjects she'd mentioned wanting to learn about. One morning it was a text on border diplomacy. Another day, a collection of poetry by a writer she'd mentioned once in passing. Miriam would find wildflowers on her breakfast tray, never with a note, just a reminder that someone was thinking of her. When she mentioned offhand that she missed the view from the East Tower, he had furniture moved there so she could use it as a reading space. They trained together in wolf form now, running the forest paths under the moon. His wolf no longer saw hers as a threat, but as a partner, someone who ran beside him instead of away from him. The first time their wolves had touched, noses bumping gently in the moonlight, Kale had felt tears prick his eyes. Slowly, the careful distance between them began to shrink. Their hands would brush when passing documents. Their shoulders would touch when they both leaned over the same map. One evening in the library, Miriam had fallen asleep over a book about ancient pack structures, and Kale had simply sat nearby, reading his own book, stealing glances at her peaceful face. When she'd stirred awake, confused and embarrassed, he'd already draped his jacket over her shoulders and moved back to a respectful distance. "You could have woken me," she'd said, rubbing her eyes. "I could have," he'd agreed. "But you looked peaceful, and I liked being near you while you felt safe enough to sleep." Another night, walking back from a council meeting, Miriam had taken his hand, just twined her fingers with his and kept walking like it was the most natural thing in the world. Kale had stopped breathing for several seconds before managing to squeeze back gently. "Is this all right?" she'd asked, looking up at him with those eyes that still made his heart stutter. "More than all right," he'd managed. "But Miriam, I need you to know. When I doubt, when I get scared, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to say it out loud instead of hiding it. Is that all right with you?" "Yes," she'd said simply. "That's exactly what I need you to do." And he had. One morning, watching her laugh with Oren over breakfast, Kale had felt the old paranoia rising. Instead of testing her, instead of creating some elaborate way to check her loyalty, he'd simply asked if they could talk privately. In the quiet of the garden, he'd told her the truth. "When I see you comfortable with other people, part of me still panics. Part of me wonders if you'll realize you deserve better than a broken king." She'd taken his face in her hands. "Then I'll keep reminding you that I chose you. Not because you're perfect, but because you're working to be better. And when you feel that panic, you bring it to me. Every time. Promise?" "I promise," Tonight, months after that kiss, after all those small moments of choosing each other, Kale was exhausted in a way he'd never been before. He'd spent the day mediating a border dispute personally, standing in the cold rain for hours to hear both sides fairly. He'd returned to the palace drenched and aching, but satisfied. He'd changed into dry clothes and built up the fire in his chamber, intending to review some documents before bed. But the moment he'd sat in his chair, the leather, warm and familiar, the fire crackling softly, his body had betrayed him. His eyes had closed. Not from a test, not from strategy, but from genuine, bone-deep exhaustion. His head had tipped back against the chair, and for the first time in over a year, he'd fallen asleep naturally, peacefully, trusting that he was safe. Miraine had knocked on his door 20 minutes later, bringing the tea she'd promised to share with him after his long day. When he didn't answer, she'd used the key he'd given her the month before. Another act of trust, freely offered. She'd found him asleep in his chair, the document still sitting untouched on the side table. Her breath had caught at the sight. His face was relaxed, peaceful, with none of the tension that usually marked his features. One hand rested on the arm of the chair, loose and trusting. For a moment, she'd just stood there, remembering another night by this same fire, remembering the weight of her resignation letter, the feeling of his scarred knuckles under her lips, the certainty that she was saying goodbye forever. How far they'd come since then. How much they'd both grown. She set the tea down quietly and knelt beside his chair, just as she had months ago. But this time, there was no test, no pretense, just a man who had worked himself to exhaustion for his people, and a woman who loved him enough to let him rest. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, gentle enough not to wake him. His skin was warm under her fingers. She could see the faint scar along his jaw. The one she now knew came from defending a village from raiders when he was barely 20. So many scars, inside and out, and he was working every day to heal them. Without really planning to, she settled into the space beside his chair, her back against the side, her head resting near his knee. She could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, feel the warmth of the fire. This was peace. This was safety. This was what they'd both been fighting for. She didn't know how long she sat there before she felt his hand move, fingers gently threading through her hair. Her eyes flew open to find him looking down at her, his expression soft with sleep and something deeper. "Hi," he said, his voice rough and warm. "Hi." She smiled up at him. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." "I'm not sorry." His fingers kept moving through her hair, the touch gentle and reverent. "How long have you been here?" "I don't know. 20 minutes? You look so peaceful. I didn't want to disturb you." He shifted in his chair, making space. "Come here." She rose and let him pull her into his lap, settling sideways across his legs with her head against his shoulder. His arms came around her, holding her carefully, like she was something precious. The bracelet she'd given him all those years ago was still tied around his wrist. He wore it every day now, visible and honored. "I fell asleep," he said, sounding almost awed. "Really fell asleep. No nightmares, no blackouts. Just sleep." "You've been working so hard," she murmured, her fingers playing with the collar of his shirt. "You needed it. I haven't slept like that since before the poisoning. Since before everything fell apart." He pressed his lips to her hair. "You did that. You make me feel safe enough to rest." She turned her face into his neck, breathing in his scent. "You do the same for me." They sat like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, the fire crackling softly beside them. Kale's hand traced lazy patterns on her back, and she could feel his heartbeat steady and strong under her palm. "Miraine," he said eventually, his voice quiet. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know you can say no, or tell me to wait, or..." She lifted her head to look at him, cutting off his nervous rambling with a gentle kiss. "Ask me." He took a breath, and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection mixing with hope. "Stay with me. Not just tonight. Every night. As my partner, my equal, my queen. Marry me. Build this new kingdom with me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving I can be the man you deserve." Tears pricked her eyes. "You already are that man. Is that a yes?" She kissed him again, deeper this time, pouring every ounce of love and trust into it. His arms tightened around her, and she felt him smile against her lips. When they broke apart, she was crying and laughing at the same time. "Yes," she said, "to all of it. Yes." He stood, lifting her with him like she weighed nothing, and spun her around once before setting her down carefully. Then he dropped to one knee, right there by the fire where he'd once pretended to sleep, and took her hands in his. "I won't be perfect," he said, looking up at her with eyes that held no walls, no tests, just raw honesty. I'll have bad days. I'll get scared and need reassurance. I'll probably drive you crazy with how protective I get. But I will never, ever test you again. I will trust you with everything I am. And I will love you until my last breath. She dropped to her knees in front of him, framing his face with her hands. I won't be perfect either. I'll be stubborn. I'll challenge you when I think you're wrong. I'll probably drive you crazy with how much I mother everyone in the kingdom. But I will always be honest with you. I will always come to you with my fears. And I will love you until my last breath. They kissed there on the floor beside the fire. And it was different from every kiss before. There was heat. Yes, a building desire that made them both breathless. But underneath was something stronger. Trust earned through action, love proven through patience, and the certainty that they would face whatever came next together. When they finally pulled apart, Cale rested his forehead against hers. Stay tonight? Just to sleep. I want to wake up and see you there. Know it's real. I'll stay, she promised. Every night from now on. They moved to his bed. That massive expanse that had once seemed lonely and cold. Now it felt perfect, big enough for them to sprawl together. Miraine settled against his side, her head on his chest, their legs tangled. His arm came around her, holding her close, and she felt him relax completely. Thank you, he whispered into the darkness. For what? For saving me. Twice. Once when I was a wolf pup in a snare, and again when I was a king trapped in his own castle. She smiled against his chest. You saved me too. You gave me a home, a purpose, a love I never thought I'd find. His breathing began to slow, evening out into the rhythm of sleep. Miraine stayed awake a little longer, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. The man who never slept was resting peacefully in her arms. The king who tested everyone had finally learned to trust. In the dying firelight, she saw the shadows of who they'd been. The broken king and the frightened maid. The test that had almost destroyed them. But beside those shadows were new shapes, stronger and brighter. The leader and his partner, the wolf and his mate. Two people who had chosen love over fear, trust over testing, and truth over survival. Miraine pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart, and let herself drift off to sleep. And in the morning, when Kael woke with her still in his arms, he cried again. But this time, they were tears of joy. The king who never slept finally rests. Not because the poison is gone, not because the enemies have vanished, but because the person he tested most chose to stay, chose to believe in him, chose to build something real out of the ashes of fear and doubt. This is where their story truly begins, not with a test, but with trust, not with tears of pain, but with tears of joy. Together, they'll rebuild a kingdom. Together, they'll prove that love is not just soft, it's also strong enough to survive anything. And every night, they'll fall asleep by the fire, no longer pretending, no longer testing, just choosing each other, again and again and again.